Dog interrupts baptism, sits next to priest. What happens next will amaze you. The small stone church sat nestled among the rolling hills, its steeple reaching toward the heavens as if in silent prayer. On this crisp Sunday morning, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant patterns of red, gold, and blue across the white marble floor. The air inside was filled with anticipation, a sacred stillness broken only by the quiet murmurs of the gathered congregation. Father Michael stood near the baptismal font, his long white vestments flowing gently as he prepared for one of his favorite parts of ministry, baptizing the newest members of his congregation. Baptism to him was a sacred act of welcoming a soul into God's family. It was a moment of profound grace, a renewal of faith for all who bore witness. Today's ceremony was especially meaningful. The baby to be baptized was Angela, an infant with cherubic cheeks and wide, curious eyes. Her parents, Linda and Mark, beamed with pride as they cradled her. Linda adjusted the lacy bonnet on Angela's head, while Mark held her tiny hand, their faces alight with joy. For them, this was not just a ritual, but a moment of hope, a blessing for their beloved daughter as she began her spiritual journey. The congregation watched intently, the soft rustling of hymnals the only sound as they settled into their pews. Angela cooed softly in her mother's arms, her tiny fingers gripping the edge of the delicate blanket draped around her. Father Michael cleared his throat and raised his hand, signaling the start of the ceremony. The sunlight seemed to brighten as he spoke, illuminating the font and the holy water that shimmered within it.
Dear brothers and sisters,
He began, his voice resonant yet gentle.
we gather today to witness the sacred baptism of this child, Angela, as she is welcomed into the light of Christ. Let us pray together for her journey in faith.
Just as Father Michael reached for the small silver ladle to sprinkle water over Angela, a deep, resonant creak echoed through the church. The heavy wooden doors, closed tightly against the crisp autumn air, began to swing open. Every head turned toward the entrance, the congregation collectively holding its breath. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. Through the open doors trotted a large, shaggy dog, a Saint Bernard, its thick coat a blend of tawny brown and white. It moved with purpose, each step deliberate, as though it had been summoned. Gasps rippled through the pews. A few children whispered excitedly to their parents, while others simply stared in awe. The dog paused at the threshold, its warm brown eyes scanning the room, before it continued down the center aisle. Father Michael froze, the silver ladle still in his hand, as he watched the animal approach. There was no aggression in its movements, no hesitation. It was as if the dog knew exactly where it was meant to go. Reaching the front of the church, the dog sat down beside Father Michael, its posture calm and regal, its eyes, deep and knowing, fixed on Angela. The silence in the room was palpable, the congregation unsure of what to make of this unexpected visitor. For a moment, Father Michael considered ushering the dog out, but something stopped him. There was an air about the animal, something peaceful, almost sacred. He decided to continue.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit,
He said, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. As he spoke, the dog did something extraordinary. It lowered its head, bowing slightly, as though in reverence. A murmur spread through the congregation, disbelief mingled with wonder. Father Michael dipped the ladle into the font and gently poured water over Angela's forehead. The baby, startled by the sudden coolness, began to cry. Her tiny wails echoed through the church, drawing sympathetic smiles from the congregation. Before anyone could react, the dog leaned forward, its wet nose brushing against Angela's small hand. The baby's cries stopped instantly. She stared at the dog, her tears replaced by wide-eyed wonder. A giggle bubbled from her lips as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the dog's soft fur. The congregation collectively exhaled, laughter and relief mingling with their amazement. Father Michael finished the blessing, his heart racing with a mixture of awe and gratitude. As he concluded the ceremony, the dog remained by his side, its tail wagging gently in perfect rhythm with his movements. When the final prayers were said, Angela's parents approached Father Michael, their faces glowing with happiness.
Thank you, Father.
Linda said, cradling Angela against her shoulder.
That was beautiful.
Father Michael glanced down at the dog, which was now sitting quietly at his feet.
I think we have our unexpected guest to thank for making it even more special,
He replied, his tone light but tinged with curiosity. After the congregation began to disperse, Father Michael knelt beside the dog. It regarded him calmly, its tail thumping once against the marble floor.
Where did you come from, friend?
He murmured, running a hand through its thick fur. The dog didn't respond, of course, but its steady gaze felt almost human. As he stood, Father Michael's eyes were drawn to the ancient baptismal font behind him. Carved into the weathered stone beneath it was an image he had never noticed before. It depicted a dog, a creature remarkably similar to the one standing before him. The Latin inscription beneath the carving was faint but legible: Custos Angelorum, guardian of angels. A chill ran down Father Michael's spine. He turned back to the dog, but before he could say anything, it stood, stretched, and trotted down the aisle. The congregation, now gathered outside the church, watched as the dog disappeared into the hills, its golden fur catching the light one last time before it vanished from sight. For days afterward, the townspeople spoke of the mysterious dog. Where had it come from? Was it a stray or something more? Some whispered that it was an angel in disguise, sent to protect the faithful. Others believed it was simply a loyal dog that had found its way to the church by chance. But when the dog returned for the next baptism, sitting once again beside Father Michael and bowing its head at the blessings, it became clear that this was no ordinary animal. The congregation began to call it Custos, honoring the inscription on the ancient font. Custos became a beloved presence, its appearances a sign of grace and protection. And so the legend of the guardian of angels was reborn in the hearts of the faithful. As the weeks passed, Custos became a regular and cherished presence in the small church nestled among the rolling hills. What had begun as a miraculous appearance during baby Angela's baptism quickly grew into an unspoken ritual. The dog never missed a ceremony, arriving just before Father Michael began his blessings. It would trot down the aisle with the same purposeful gait, sit beside the priest, and bow its head reverently during each blessing. The congregation grew accustomed to the dog's presence, finding comfort in its calm demeanor and quiet devotion. Each Sunday after the final prayers, the dog would slowly rise and walk out the doors, its golden coat glistening in the sunlight, only to disappear into the distance as mysteriously as it had come. No one knew where it went or where it came from, but its appearances were as reliable as the church bells that rang every Sunday morning. Father Michael watched the dog with a growing sense of reverence. There was something undeniably special about Custos. It wasn't just the way the dog appeared during baptisms, nor was it simply its uncanny ability to comfort the babies in their moments of distress. It was something deeper, something sacred. The connection between the dog and the church, between the dog and the congregation, felt like a divine gift. But it was Angela, T, who formed the most profound bond with the dog. As the months passed, she grew from a cooing infant to a curious toddler. Her wide, expressive eyes filled with wonder as she discovered the world around her, and Custos was a constant companion in her growing exploration of faith. Each Sunday after Mass, as the congregation mingled and made their way out of the church, Angela would eagerly run to the front of the altar, where the dog sat waiting for her. She would giggle and reach out to pet the dog's soft fur, her tiny fingers finding their way into the thick coat, leaving behind traces of her innocent touch. At first, Angela's parents, Linda and Mark, were a bit hesitant. They didn't know where the dog came from, and they worried about letting her get too close to an animal they didn't fully understand. But over time, they realized the bond between the child and the dog was pure and unexplainable. There was something comforting in the way the dog responded to Angela, its eyes softening whenever she was near, its tail wagging gently in greeting. It was as though Custos recognized the little girl in ways her parents couldn't comprehend. On Sundays after Mass, while the congregation filed out of the church, Angela would often linger in the back. Custos would stay with her, content to sit by her side, its warm, steady presence a grounding force in her life. There in the quiet after the crowd dispersed, Angela would talk to the dog, her words simple but filled with a deep affection. She would pat the dog's head, offering crumbs from the communion bread, giggling as Custos licked her fingers in response. Sometimes Mark and Linda would watch from the back of the church, marveling at the connection between their daughter and the dog. There were no words to describe it, only a sense of peace, a sense of being watched over, as if the church itself had become a sanctuary for their little family. Father Michael, too, noticed the bond growing between Angela and the dog. The priest found himself drawn to the pair. He would often linger after Mass, watching them as Angela laughed and played with Custos, her small hands brushing through the dog's fur. He had never seen a child and an animal form such a seamless connection. It was as if Custos had been placed there specifically for her. One afternoon, as the last rays of the sun streamed through the stained glass, Father Michael found himself standing beside Angela and Custos, deep in thought. He observed how the dog nuzzled Angela's hand gently as she whispered something into its ear. The bond was undeniable. Custos was not just a guardian of the church, but a protector of Angela, a companion in her quiet journey of faith. The priest's curiosity grew. In the days that followed, he began researching the history of the church, poring over dusty records and ancient texts. He sought out old parishioners who might know something about the carving beneath the baptismal font, the one depicting a dog, its form remarkably similar to Custos. After weeks of digging, Father Michael uncovered a series of old stories dating back to the church's founding. The tales spoke of a guardian dog, one that appeared during times of crisis to protect the faithful. The dog was said to have belonged to the original founder of the church, a priest named Father Tommaso, who had been a steadfast protector of the community during difficult times. Legend had it that the dog had never left the church, appearing at critical moments to shield the parishioners from harm. One story stood out among the rest. It told of a great storm that had ravaged the town years ago, flooding the streets and threatening the church's very foundation. The dog, then just a pup, had guided Father Tommaso and several townspeople to safety in the church's crypt, saving them from the raging waters. The locals believed that the dog had been sent by God to protect the faithful, and the story of its bravery became woven into the fabric of the church's history. Father Michael's heart swelled with awe as he read these accounts. The stories spoke not only of the dog's protection, but also of its unwavering devotion. It seemed to be a celestial guardian, chosen for its sacred duty. The dog's presence during baptisms now made even more sense. The priest couldn't help but wonder if Custos was indeed the same dog from those ancient tales, returning once more to fulfill its role as protector. But there was more to the dog's mystery, Father Michael felt. Custos had arrived during Angela's baptism, and in a strange way, it seemed as though its arrival had been preordained, as if the child had been chosen, just like the dog. He couldn't ignore the possibility that the dog had come for Angela, not just for the baptisms, but for something deeper. Perhaps it was watching over her, guiding her through the early years of her life. As the days passed, Father Michael grew more contemplative. He knew deep in his heart that something was unfolding here, something beyond his understanding. And though he wasn't yet sure what it meant, he felt a sense of divine trust in the quiet moments between Angela and Custos. Meanwhile, Angela's family grew ever more comfortable with the dog's presence. They had come to see Custos not as an anomaly, but as a part of their lives, part of their faith. It wasn't uncommon now for them to spend time with Custos after Mass, walking through the fields around the church or simply sitting in the sun. Angela's laughter filling the air as Custos looked on with quiet affection. The years had passed and Angela had grown from a quiet, wide-eyed infant to a lively, curious young girl. Every Sunday she eagerly anticipated the church service and her time with Custos, the dog who had become her constant companion. Now at 7 years old, she was able to roam around the church grounds with the freedom of a child whose imagination had no boundaries. Her parents, Linda and Mark, had long since accepted the dog's mysterious yet consistent presence. Every Sunday as they attended Mass, they trusted that Custos would be there, always at the right moment, always by their daughter's side. It had become a quiet, comforting ritual. Father Michael would bless the congregation, Custos would sit beside him, and afterward, Angela would rush to the front, greeting the dog with joy and laughter. The bond between them had deepened, and with it, the sense of security that came from knowing Custos would always be there to watch over her. On one particular Sunday, the sun shone brightly through the stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the church's white marble floors. After Mass, Angela's family lingered outside, chatting with Father Michael in the parking lot. The air was crisp and the scent of fresh grass filled the air as the small congregation gathered around, exchanging pleasantries and discussing the week's events. Custos sat near Angela's feet, calm as always, its eyes watching the group with a steady, protective gaze.
Angela, don't wander too far.
Her mother called out, a note of caution in her voice. Angela had a tendency to wander, to chase after butterflies or pick wildflowers from the church grounds. Today was no different. With a wave to her parents, she scampered off toward the edge of the parking lot, where the grassy embankment sloped down to the roadside. The family's attention was diverted for a moment as Father Michael began a conversation with Mark about the upcoming church events. The congregation was small, but there was always something new to discuss. In the midst of the chatter, no one noticed Angela's movements as she made her way toward the road, her small feet carrying her across the soft earth. She had spotted a patch of wildflowers just beyond the edge of the parking lot, and her heart leapt with the excitement of collecting them for her little bouquet. She bent down, her fingers brushing against the delicate petals as she smiled to herself. The world seemed so simple, so full of wonder. She could hear the distant hum of a car engine, but it felt so far away, so far removed from the peace she had come to expect. But the peace was about to shatter. Unbeknownst to Angela, a truck was speeding down the road. The driver, distracted by something on the radio, had not noticed the small figure in the distance. The sound of the truck's engine grew louder, and Angela, still crouched by the flowers, was completely unaware of the danger approaching. She was too focused on her task to hear the screeching tires or the honking horn as the vehicle veered toward her. Just as the truck drew near, a blur of golden fur shot across the grass. In an instant, Custos was upon her. The dog leapt forward, his powerful legs propelling him with an almost supernatural speed. Without hesitation, he slammed into Angela's side, knocking her out of the truck's path just as the vehicle passed. The force of the impact sent the dog tumbling to the ground, rolling across the gravel as the truck roared past, its tires screeching in protest. The world seemed to slow as Angela's parents turned in horror, their faces drained of color as they saw what had just unfolded. Mark and Linda screamed her name, rushing toward her as they saw her lying safely on the grass, her wide eyes filled with shock. But it was Custos, the dog, who lay motionless a few feet away, its body still. Father Michael, who had heard the commotion, turned to see the aftermath. His heart stopped as he saw Custos lying in the parking lot, injured but still alive. Without thinking, he ran to the dog's side, dropping to his knees beside it.
Father, is he?
Mark gasped, his voice choked with emotion as he crouched beside his daughter, who was now crying softly, still in shock from what had just happened. Father Michael didn't answer immediately. His hand hovered over the dog's still form, his heart racing. It was clear that Custos had taken the full brunt of the impact, his body showing signs of injury. One of his legs was twisted awkwardly beneath him, and there was a deep gash on his side where the gravel had torn at his skin. But there was still life in him. Father Michael's eyes narrowed as he whispered a prayer, the words coming to him instinctively, as if they had been written into his soul long ago. He placed a hand gently on the dog's head, his voice a soft murmur as he asked for God's mercy and healing.
Please, Father, protect this servant of yours,
He whispered.
May your will be done.
The congregation, which had gathered in a concerned circle around the family, held its collective breath. No one spoke as Father Michael continued to pray, his voice rising with quiet conviction. Angela, still shaken, clung to her parents, her wide eyes never leaving the dog.
Custos, please don't leave us.
She whispered, her small voice trembling. She had always believed in the dog's protective power, and now as she looked at him, so still and battered, she couldn't imagine life without him. He had always been there, always a silent sentinel, watching over her and her family. To everyone's surprise, as Father Michael's prayer reached its peak, Custos stirred. A soft groan escaped the dog's throat, and his golden eyes fluttered open, meeting Angela's gaze. Slowly, as if gathering his strength, Custos lifted his head and nudged Angela's hand with his snout, as if to reassure her that he was not gone. The relief was palpable. Mark and Linda let out a collective sigh, their tension easing as they realized the dog had survived. Father Michael, too, smiled with quiet reverence. It was nothing short of a miracle,
Thank God.
Mark whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Father Michael helped Angela to her feet, guiding her toward Custos. She knelt beside the dog, her tiny fingers reaching out to pet his fur. Despite the obvious pain he was in, Custos responded by nuzzling her hand with gentle affection. The priest, knowing the dog needed medical attention, instructed the congregation to help transport Custos to the nearest veterinarian. But for now, there was a sense of peace in the air. The dog had saved Angela's life, just as he had saved the lives of countless others in the past. As they all gathered around, waiting for the veterinarian to arrive, Father Michael closed his eyes for a moment, offering a final prayer of thanks.
Thank you, Cousteau.
He whispered, his voice filled with awe.
You are indeed a guardian of angels.
The days following the accident were filled with a sense of wonder and awe that no one in the small town could shake off. News of Cousteau's miraculous recovery spread quickly, reaching even the farthest corners of the community. No one could explain how the dog, severely injured in the collision, had bounced back so rapidly, except that they knew one thing for certain. Something extraordinary was at play. Father Michael, having witnessed firsthand the dog's courage and divine intervention, found himself increasingly drawn to the mystery of Custos, reflecting on his own beliefs and the strange events that had unfolded. It was early the next morning when Father Michael stood at the church's front doors, looking out over the familiar rolling hills that stretched beyond the town. The sun was still low in the sky, casting golden hues over the land, and as he inhaled the crisp morning air, he felt a deep sense of peace. A quiet voice in his heart whispered that something significant had shifted within the community, something that would echo for years to come. The dog, Custos, had not only saved Angela's life, but had become an emblem of faith and divine protection. The rapid recovery of Custos amazed Dr. Karen Albright, the local veterinarian who had attended to him in the wake of the accident. She had been cautiously optimistic when she first examined him. The wounds from the truck were serious and the dog's prognosis was uncertain. Yet within days of his treatment, Custos began to show signs of an incredible recovery. The gash along his side, which had seemed so deep and severe, healed at a rate she had never witnessed before. The swelling in his leg began to diminish, and the limp that had seemed so pronounced was lessening with each passing day. Dr. Albright, who had spent years in her practice, could not explain what had happened. In all her experience, she had never seen an animal recover so swiftly, let alone with the emotional and physical trauma Custos had endured. She had been prepared for the possibility of a long, arduous healing process, but instead, Custos defied medical expectations. She couldn't help but wonder if the dog's recovery was more than just biology at work. Perhaps it was something divine. She had seen the love and devotion Custos inspired in Angela and the entire town. And though she had always considered herself a woman of science, she began to entertain the notion that there was something miraculous about this animal. Father Michael noticed the change in the atmosphere at the church as well. What had once been a place of quiet reverence now seemed to hum with a greater energy, a palpable sense of awe. The dog's miraculous recovery had sparked something deeper in the hearts of the townspeople. It wasn't just about Angela anymore. It was about the belief that something supernatural had occurred, and that Custos was not merely an ordinary dog. He was something more, a guardian sent to protect the faithful, a divine protector whose presence was a sign of God's grace. For Angela, the accident had solidified her faith in ways that words could not express. She had always been a thoughtful child, but the experience of nearly losing her life and having Custos save her had planted seeds of understanding that blossomed into a deep and unwavering trust in the divine. The bond between her and the dog grew stronger each day, and though Custos had always been a source of comfort for her, now he seemed like a living miracle, a constant reminder that God's love was tangible, present, and ready to intervene in times of great need. Angela often found herself reflecting on the accident, sitting quietly in the church garden with Custos by her side. She would run her fingers through his fur, lost in thought as she recalled the truck's blaring horn, the screeching tires, and the moment she felt herself pulled to safety. She had no memory of how the dog had reached her so quickly, or how, in the blink of an eye, Custos had pushed her out of the way of the speeding truck. What she remembered clearly was the dog's presence, the calmness of his brown eyes and the way he had nudged her hand as the truck roared past, his protective instinct guiding her into safety.
Thank you.
She would whisper to him, stroking his head.
You saved me. You're my angel.
Angela believed, without a doubt, that Custos had been sent to protect her, and she began to view the dog as more than just a pet. To her, Custos was her guardian angel, sent by God to watch over her in the town. She would tell her parents this every night before bed, and they too began to accept the idea. Mark and Linda had always been devout people, but they, like many others, had never expected to experience such a personal miracle. They had always seen Custos as a lovable stray, a dog with a rough exterior but a good heart. But after the accident, they saw him in an entirely new light. Now they understood that Custos was more than just a pet. He was a divine messenger, sent to protect and guide them. The community too began to see Custos as a miraculous guardian. It wasn't just the accident that had changed their perception of the dog. It was the quiet, constant presence he had maintained in their lives. For years, the dog had attended every baptism, every Sunday Mass, and every major church event, always showing up at just the right moment, as if he knew exactly when he was needed. Now people began to share stories of times when Custos had been there for them, providing comfort or guidance during difficult moments in their lives. Maggie, the local shopkeeper, spoke often of how Custos had been there when her husband had fallen ill several years ago. She had been walking home from the store, worried and anxious about her husband's condition, when she had rounded the corner and found Custos waiting for her. The dog had sat beside her, calmly offering her his quiet presence, and, for reasons she couldn't explain, her fear seemed to dissipate. She had later learned that her husband had been stabilized that evening, and Maggie believed that Custos' presence had been a sign of reassurance. Jacob, the elderly farmer who lived on the outskirts of town, shared his story of Custos showing up during the darkest time of his life. He had been struggling with depression after losing his wife, and every day felt like a heavy burden. But one morning, while sitting alone on his porch, he saw Custos coming down the road, his shaggy fur blowing in the wind. The dog approached him slowly, as if sensing his sorrow, and sat beside him, resting his head on Jacob's knee. Jacob had always been a man of few words, but he swore that in that moment, Custos had communicated something beyond words, something that filled him with a sense of peace he had not felt in years.
These small moments,
Jacob would tell anyone who would listen.
they may not seem like much, but I know the dog is a blessing. He brings a peace that's hard to explain.
Father Michael had heard many such stories in the weeks following the accident, and he began to realize that Custos was not just a protector of one child or one family, but of the entire community. The dog had been a silent witness to the lives of those around him, offering comfort and solace when it was most needed. As Father Michael continued his research, he came to understand that Custos was indeed a miraculous being, one sent to guide, protect, and inspire. The church itself became a place of pilgrimage, not just for its historical significance, but for the divine energy that seemed to emanate from it, a blessing that came in the form of a dog named Custos. People traveled from nearby towns, hoping to witness the miracle for themselves, to feel the comfort that so many had experienced. They would arrive, sit in the pews and wait, hoping that Custos would appear, bringing with him the peace and reassurance they sought. For Angela, the days following the accident were a time of deep reflection and connection. As she grew older, her understanding of the divine became more nuanced, but she never lost her unwavering belief that Custos was her guardian. She had learned to trust in his presence, and in the quiet moments they shared together, she felt a bond that transcended the ordinary, a bond forged by faith, love, and the miraculous protection of a dog who had, in the most extraordinary way, saved her life. Years passed, and Angela grew from a quiet, thoughtful child into a young woman full of purpose and grace. As she matured, her understanding of the world around her deepened, and so did her connection to the dog who had saved her life. Custos had become more than just a guardian to Angela. He had become a symbol of her own faith, steadfast, unyielding, and filled with grace. Though she was no longer the timid girl she had once been, Angela's bond with Custos remained as strong as ever. In her teenage years, Angela often visited the church to spend time with the dog. The pews that once echoed with her shy prayers now felt like a second home to her. And the sanctuary of the church had become a sacred place where she could reflect on her life, her faith, and her growing understanding of the world. Each time she sat beside Custos, whether on the church steps or near the altar, she felt the same peaceful reassurance she had felt when she was a little girl, when Custos had rushed to her side and saved her from certain danger. She would often find herself talking to the dog, sharing her thoughts and dreams, just as one would confide in a dear friend. Custos, with his calm and knowing eyes, seemed to understand every word, his presence always steady and comforting. He was her constant companion, not just during moments of joy, but also in her times of uncertainty. Through the years, Angela never once doubted that the dog had been sent into her life for a reason far beyond anyone's understanding. As Custos continued to grow older, his visits to the church remained as reliable as ever. He attended every baptism, every mass, and every ceremony with the same dignified presence he had exhibited since his first appearance. It was as though the dog understood the importance of these moments, his silent vigilance, a reminder of the sacredness of the rituals and the significance of the new lives entering the community. Custos' appearance became a cherished part of each baptism, his solemn presence inspiring faith and wonder in everyone who witnessed it. It wasn't just the families of the children being baptized who marveled at the sight. It was the entire congregation who saw in the dog's actions a tangible reminder of the divine guardianship watching over them all. Father Michael, too, had come to see Custos as a living symbol of divine protection and grace. He had witnessed firsthand the bond between the dog and Angela, and it had become clear to him that Custos was a vessel of God's love, a messenger who had been sent to protect, guide, and inspire. He often found himself reflecting on the lessons that the dog's presence had taught him, the power of faith, the importance of guardianship, and the many unseen blessings that God bestows upon his people. The priest knew that Custos had brought something profoundly spiritual to their community, something that transcended the ordinary and pointed to a higher truth. Inspired by Custos, Father Michael delivered a powerful sermon one Sunday, one that would become a defining moment for the entire congregation. It was on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day that seemed to carry a sacred stillness with it, that he took to the pulpit and spoke with conviction about the nature of guardianship, faith, and the hidden blessings that often go unnoticed.
My dear friends,
He began, his voice steady but filled with emotion.
we are all blessed in ways that we often fail to see. Just as we have our earthly guardians, parents, family, and friends, so too does our Lord send us spiritual guardians, those who watch over us even when we do not realize it. Some of these guardians are angels, and some are in the form of creatures like Custos, who walks among us with the strength of a protector and the heart of a servant.
He paused, glancing down at Custos, who lay quietly at the foot of the altar, his tail gently wagging as the congregation's gaze followed the priest.
Custos has shown us
Father Michael continued.
that true guardianship is not always about grand gestures or dramatic acts. It is about the quiet, steady presence that reassures us in times of trouble and reminds us that we are never alone. Through his devotion, this dog has become a living testament to the faith we hold dear and a reminder that we are always watched over, even in the most unexpected ways.
As Father Michael spoke, Angela sat in the pew, her heart swelling with gratitude and reverence. She could feel the truth of the priest's words deep in her soul. Custos had saved her life, but more than that, he had taught her the meaning of protection, of loyalty, and of love that transcends the physical. In his quiet way, Custos had shown her the importance of faith, not just in moments of crisis, but in every moment of life. After the sermon, the congregation lingered in the church, many of them approaching Father Michael to share their thoughts and reflections on the message. There was a sense of awe in the air, a quiet recognition that the dog was no longer just a beloved pet, but a symbol of divine care. People shared their own experiences of feeling comforted by Custos's presence, of how the dog had been a source of peace during moments of personal struggle. Some spoke of feeling a profound sense of calm whenever Custos was near, while others recalled the warmth in their hearts whenever they saw him attending a baptism or sitting solemnly by the altar. The miracle that had begun with Angela's near-death experience had rippled out to touch the entire community, bringing them closer together in their shared belief that they were all protected by something greater than themselves. As the sun began to set on that autumn afternoon, Angela found herself sitting alone on the steps of the church, with Custos resting beside her, his head resting on her lap. The hills stretched out before them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The town lay peaceful in the distance, a quiet, steadfast presence in the heart of the valley. Angela gazed at the scene, reflecting on all that had happened in her life and how Custos had been there through it all. The dog had saved her life once, but more than that, he had taught her that the divine is present in the simplest of moments. Whether in the bond between a girl and her dog, in the quiet protection of an unseen guardian, or in the love and faith shared by a community united in belief. In that still moment, Angela understood the lasting legacy of Custos, the guardian who had watched over her, who had brought the town together, and who would forever be a symbol of the faith that held them all together. With a smile, Angela whispered softly,
Thank you, Custos. You've taught me more than I ever imagined.
and as the dog rested his head on her lap, it seemed that the world was a little brighter, a little more peaceful, and a little more filled with the blessings of faith.